So, oh, that's a great answer. Thanks, Josh. All right, welcome to Turning Grapes into Wine. This is a beginner level class where we're going to talk about how we go from grapes in the vineyard to a glass of wine to be able to consume. Just a reminder, this is a live recording. So thank you so much, first off, for taking the time to take this class. I hope you enjoy it and I hope you learn something from it. I do have everyone muted and I don't have it to where you can unmute yourself at this moment. We can unmute once we get towards the questions portion at the very end. But as I said, this is a recording class. So if you do have questions, I want you to feel comfortable asking them through the chat function. With beginner classes, I want to make sure everyone feels like they're understanding what I'm saying. So if I say something that maybe you don't understand what it is, please, there's no stupid questions in my classes. Please go through the chat function and just type in your question. I'll be monitoring the chats as we go through. So this is a live recorded class. That's the biggest reason why I have everybody muted is I don't want the screen to go to somebody else. I want you to be able to, whoever watches this on the live recording can just get the class for what it is. And if you are a basic plan member or an industry education plan member on the site, you will have access to watch this live recording anytime you'd like. It will be uploaded to the Wine Basics page underneath the classes menu, and it will be on there to go back to if you ever have something that you were like, oh, I forgot what she said, or you just want to watch it again, whatever the case is, it will be on that page. You do have to be a paid member to see that, either the basic plan or the industry plan, which we'll cover at the very end what both of those are. So without further ado, what is wine? So wine is an alcoholic beverage made from fermented grape juice in all intents and purposes when we are speaking about everyday wine. Technically, wine can be made from any type of fruit. However, we are only going to be speaking about fermented grape juice wines today. What's going to happen is from the vineyard, the life cycle of the vine usually starts somewhere between April, let's say March and April is typically when the life cycle of the vine is going to start. The vine is going to start flowering, and those flowers are then going to turn into berries or into grapes. In roughly May or June, those grapes are going to start to really form. You'll just see flowers and it's called inflorescence. It's basically what the stem looks like before all the berries are actually on it, or once you eat a whole bunch of berries off of the stem, just those little stem parts left is what it's going to look like in the beginning. Then those grapes are going to start to form, and most grapes, or almost all grapes, are going to start with being green in color. And depending on what hemisphere you're in, I'm just going to speak in Northern Hemisphere right now. Typically in July or so, you are going to start seeing any berries that are meant to be red berries are going to start to turn color. So that middle picture there, you can see some of the berries are still green, some of them are starting to turn a little bit red, and some of them are a little bit darker purple. That's called veraison, which is just the time where the grapes are going to start ripening. And when they start to ripen, they actually turn the color of what the grape is going to be when we harvest it. If you look on the left screen, that's a Chardonnay grape there. You can see some of them are still quite green, but a lot of them are turning more gold. So white wine grapes or white grapes tend to turn a little bit more golden, where of course the red grapes are going to turn either red or purple, or some of them are even like black colored with the skin. With harvest, This is going to be sometime between August and October, depending on the climate, where they're at, the grape. There's so many things that go into when they actually pick the grapes. But when the grapes are fully ripe, they will go through and pick the grapes and bring them into the winery. Before we get too much into winemaking, I just want to talk a little bit about grape anatomy. There are over 1,000 different wine grapes used commercially. There are over 10,000 wine grapes total. A lot of those will be from either Greece or from Italy, where you see tons of grapes that you've never heard of before. But commercially and more widely known, there are about 1,000 different grape varieties. And then for the average consumer, there's probably about 40 grape varieties that they would be able to recognize or typically understand when they look at the label that it's an actual grape. 99% of all grapes, if the skin has color to it, the juice inside is actually clear. So winemaking is really important when we're making red wine. There's a difference in making white wine and making red wine, and we're going to go over that. When you look at the berry itself, there are different parts of the berry that are going to affect the wine differently if it comes in contact with the juice. So on the very inside is the pulp. This is where the acid, the aromas, and the sugar lie within the berry. The pulp is the most important part of the berry itself. Inside, there are seeds, and seeds are something that is quite difficult to not have inside of the juice unless you are pulling the juice away from the solids very quickly. And the seeds tend to have tannin in them. And tannin is that sensation that is like a drying sensation on your palate when you drink red wine. Also has a little bit of a bitter flavor when you drink white wine. Then you have the stems. The stems are optional to be included in winemaking, and the stems also have tannins in them, which again is going to give either that bitter flavor to white wines or it's going to give that drying sensation to the palate on red wines. And then you have the skin. The skin is the second most important part of the grape itself when it comes to winemaking. The skin is going to include tannins, same as the seeds and the stems do. It's also going to include aromas. And a lot of times, the grapes are going to spend time sitting on the skins to be able to make an aromatic wine or a more aromatic wine. And then lastly, the skin is going to have color. The longer the skin sits in contact with the juice, the more color is going to bleed off from those skins and start to color the juice. So now we're going to bring those grapes that we just harvested into the winery. And the grapes are going to have a couple different options once they come into the winery, depending on the final desired wine style. So the first option is to destem the grapes. So when you look at the picture there on the left, you can see those stems are actually still quite green. It's a bit hard to ripen stems. You have to wait quite some time before the stems are ripe for the majority of the grape varieties. So a lot of times they don't want those harsh tannins that come from the skins. So more often than not, the stems are going to be removed from the grapes. And here's a machine that you can see on the left, the top port, you can see a bucket of grapes being poured into the machine. And then on the right, you can see underneath the machine, you can see the berries falling down. And on the left side of the machine, you can see the stems coming out. So this machine does this quite delicately. We don't want to press the grapes. We don't want to pop the berries. Some of them could end up popping, but the goal is for them not to pop. And that way the berries are now away from the stems. So again, this is completely optional. Some people prefer to leave the stems on because they think it adds some complexity to the wine. And then some people prefer to remove the stems, especially if they're not ripe, because it could give some green, kind of harsh flavors to the wine. From here, the grapes could have two paths. If the grapes are meant to be white wine in the final production, the grapes are going to be pressed very, very quickly because we don't want the skin to come in contact with the juice. The amount of time that the skin touches the juice, the more color the wine is going to have. And this comes for white wine as well. If you think about a glass of Pinot Grigio, for instance, it tends to have a little bit of a copper color to it. And that's because they're letting the golden skins, they're kind of like a golden copper color, the skin themselves, is actually going to sit with the juice for just a little bit. So even if it's a white wine, there could be just a little bit of skin contact, but in general, for the majority of white wine production, we don't want the skins to touch the juice. So very, very quickly, we're going to bring those grapes into the winery and we are going to press the juice away from the skins. And if you look at the screen, there's two different kinds of presses on the bottom. In the very middle is a champagne press. On the left side is it's just another form of a basket press. And basically what happens is on the inside of the metal kind of grater portion that is there in the middle of the machine. Oh, I can use a little. Here we go. Hopefully you guys can see my mouse there. This portion right here on the inside, there is a balloon. Within that balloon is just air that's going to press the berries up against the sides of the walls to pop the berries, and the juice is going to run down, and then the skins are going to be stuck inside of this area. Same thing here, you can see all of the skins are stuck right here where the juice is actually going to flow through the bottom and be pumped into a tank. These are the two traditional presses, and then up here is a modern press. This is going to do basically the same thing as this machine did, but at much higher volume. There's a balloon inside of that as well, where it's pressing the berries to the side. The grapes themselves are going to be stuck inside of here, and then the juice is going to fall out and be pumped into a tank. So again, with white wine, it's most important to know that we are pressing the skins away from the juice as quickly as possible. With red wine, the way we get color into that juice to turn into a red wine is by skin contact. So we are going to, instead of press the grapes, we are going to crush them, and we're going to pop the berries so the juice is now in contact with the skin. This is a very small vat, just so you can see. What happens is you can crush the berries in many different ways. You can crush them by foot. You can crush them by these metal hand-held plungers, or you can have a machine do all of this for you. This is a small vat where you can kind of see here, there's some juice and with the skins. And what's going to happen is over the course of the time that the wine is going to ferment, or the juice is going to ferment, we are going to be constantly pressing down the skins so they stay in contact with the juice. This could happen maybe once an hour, or it could happen just a few times a day. It's really dependent on how much color we want the juice to actually have and how dark the skins are, as well as going to impact the color. So from here, whether it's white or red, now this process is going to be the same. Alcoholic fermentation is going to begin. So what happens is, in the majority of wine regions, they're going to have a stainless steel tank that fermentation is conducted in. And that tank is going to have coils either on the inside or on the outside that is going to help regulate the temperature inside of the tank. With alcoholic fermentation, what happens is there is natural sugar inside of that tank because grape juice is naturally sweet. We're going to either add yeast or we are going to use just native yeast that were already on the skins or that could be inside of the winery. There's no better or worse whether you use yeast that are native to those grapes as well as native to the winery, or if you add yeast to the vat. There's arguments for both whether being good or bad, depending on the winemaker. So with the yeast is added to start consuming those sugars. It's going to consume the sugar and convert that sugar into alcohol, being the most important part because this is an alcoholic fermentation. We're turning grape juice into wine. So the first product of yeast fermentation, alcoholic fermentation, is alcohol. The second is flavors and aromas. So when you go and smell a glass of wine and you smell, maybe say it's a Cabernet and you smell blackberry and cassis and maybe some vegetal characteristics, most of that is coming from the yeast rather than the grape itself. There are some aromas and flavors that are natural to grapes, but most of those flavors become what we think of in wine through fermentation. So, for instance, if someone has a blackberry allergy, there's no worry of an allergy reaction or an allergic reaction to blackberries because there's not actually blackberries in the wine, unless it's like Arbor Mist or something like that, where they're actually adding flavor to the wine. We're only going to speak about uh, standard, typical wines, unflavored wines. And with that, it's just going to be flavors created through fermentation with the aromas of the grapes and the yeast itself. So if someone says, "Oh, I'm not a big fan of blackberries," just let them know, don't worry, it's not an actual flavor in the wine. It's just what we refer to the flavor to be. And you'll see as you start to work with people a little bit more. Some people will totally understand and know that already, and then some people you'll have to teach them a little bit about it. Along with alcohol, flavors, and aromas, we're going to have two more byproducts due to alcoholic fermentation. The first byproduct is carbon dioxide. So when you look at the majority of all fermentation tanks, they're going to be open at the top. The reason why they're open is we want that carbon dioxide to blow off. If it were to stay inside of the tank, it would create carbon dioxide within the wine, which would create a sparkling wine rather than a still wine. And we'll talk about sparkling wine production a week from today in our Sparkling Wine 101 class. So we want the tank open to blow the CO2 off so our wine remains still. And then the next byproduct is heat. And then this is why these coils, either on the inside or on the outside of the vat, are extremely important because we don't want the tank to become too hot because of fermentation. We want to keep the tank at a relatively cool temperature to make sure our wine becomes fresh and lively rather than kind of cooked as a flavor. If it gets too hot, the juice is going to kind of cook itself and become not very desirable for the majority of wine production. So again, our yeast is going to consume sugar that is naturally occurring from the grape juice itself. It's going to consume as much sugar as possible to convert that sugar into alcohol with the byproducts of flavor, aroma, carbon dioxide, and heat. Next is if we're making a white wine, we now want to press the skins or all of the solids away from the juice. This is done in a couple different ways. In the left picture here, this tank is a fermenting tank. There are skins inside, a bunch of solids inside. There's actually stems as well. and you can see it coming out. There's a filter here, so it's going to catch all of the solids. If you ever have the time during somewhere between September, October or so to get out and do a harvest with a winery, it's one of the most incredible things ever. These are actually pictures I took when I went and did harvest at Hourglass. And so what you do is someone stands right here, and as this fills up with solids, you just use this little shovel and you put all the solids over into this side. So all of this juice is going to get pumped from this little valve here, going to get pumped into another tank. These solids are still going to have juice inside of them, however. So those solids are then going to get put inside of the same press that we saw that was used for white wine. It's going to get dumped into the inside. There's a balloon inside of here that's going to press those berries up against the wall, and any remaining juice is going to fall from the bottom and then be pumped into a separate tank. Sometimes that juice is used to make a completely different wine. Sometimes that juice is put back into the same tank. Sometimes it's just held off to the side to be used just in case. This wine that's coming out just on its own is called free run juice. This is the best quality of juice used for winemaking because it's not going to be as astringent as this juice is going to be. When you have the skins in contact with the juice and you're putting pressure against those skins, it's going to impart more of those tannins, that drying sensation, that little bit of a bitter flavor. And so some people really enjoy using press wine, and some people don't use it at all. They discard it, or they sell it off to other wineries to make different wine with it. So free run juice, the best quality. Pressed juice is dependent on the winemaker if they use it. Sometimes it's used just kind of like salt and pepper in cooking, just to give a little bit of an extra pop to the wine. This is a traditional press. This is in Burgundy. This is for very small batches, where this is going to be for much larger batches. So just to reiterate, white wine is pressed before fermentation. Red wine is pressed after fermentation. Biggest reason for that is we want those skins in contact with the juice so we get a nice red color to make it a red wine. So from here, fermentation is going to be finished. Fermentation takes anywhere between roughly a week to, it could be 2 or 3 weeks, depending on the wine, the amount of sugar inside of the tank, the style of wine that they're producing. There's a lot of things that go into the specific amount of time, but on average, winemaking fermentation is going to take about a week to 2. So the next part of fermentation is an optional part. For red wine, it's almost always conducted, and for white wine, it is often conducted, but it just depends on the winemaking style. And the next portion, this is going to be after alcoholic fermentation, is going to be malolactic conversion. Now, sometimes this is referred to as malolactic fermentation, but it's not actually a fermentation, it's a conversion. So in my teachings, I call this malolactic conversion. So what happens is within a barrel, or it could be inside of a still tank where you actually add the bacteria to the tank. Typically, barrels are going to have this bacteria within them, and it's going to happen naturally within the barrel, where with stainless steel, you're going to have to add the bacteria to the tank. So this is it's a nice bacteria. It's not a detrimental bacteria to the wine. It's called Onococcus oni, and it's a bacteria that's going to convert malic acid into lactic acid. And malic acid is the same acid that is going to be in a Granny Smith apple. It's a very tart, very zippy, very zesty kind of acid. It's a more sour acid. Where lactic acid is the same acid that is in dairy products. Think about butter or cream or milk. It's a much softer, rounder style of acid. So again, this is very typical for red wine making. I can only think of one red wine off the top of my head that doesn't go through this. This is why most people tend to enjoy red wine before white wine, because red wine tends to be a little smoother. Not all, of course, there's tons of exceptions to that. But in general, red wine, because it goes through malolactic conversion, is smoother and softer on the palate. Now, for white wine, it is completely optional. If the winemaker wants the wine to be more round, more buttery, more soft kind of flavors to it, they will let this happen, or they will make this happen. If a winemaker wants their wine to be more crisp and refreshing, they will prohibit this conversion from happening. And a couple grapes that would be very easy to see the difference between is like Riesling or Sauvignon Blanc. Those really nice, crisp, refreshing, lively types of wines do not go through this. Where Chardonnay, where we think of butter, is one of the first characteristics a lot of people think of when they think of Chardonnay. Chardonnay, more often than not, goes through this malolactic conversion. And again, it's completely optional. It's very dependent on how the winemaker wants their wine style to be. Again, if you have any questions as we go through, please feel free to put them into the chat if I'm saying something that doesn't make sense, or you'd like me to make it a little bit more detailed. So next, there are so many options for using vessels with winemaking. This can be used for fermentation, or it could just be used for aging, or it could be used for both. So the four most common vessel options would be stainless steel. Stainless steel is going to create a very fresh and a very crisp style of wine. Oxygen cannot penetrate stainless steel. So this is going to be something that is keeping oxygen out. Oxygen is okay for wine in very minute portions. But just like an apple or just like an avocado, the more oxygen touches the wine or the avocado or the apple, it's going to start to turn. And that's great in some cases, but in a lot of cases, they want the wine to stay very fresh and very crisp, so they're going to keep using stainless steel. The second option, which kind of resembles stainless steel, but there's going to be a little bit more of a roundness to the wine, is using concrete. Concrete can be, there's two options here. This is at Gerard Bertrand at Clos d'Ora. And this is concrete tanks, where inside of the tank is actually concrete. Or you can use a concrete egg, or different shapes of concrete. Concrete has a touch of porosity to it, so a little bit of oxygen is going to get in. Not enough to really change the flavor of the wine, more so just to change the texture of the wine. It's still going to stay nice and fresh like the stainless steel does, but the texture is going to become a little bit more round. The next option is, this is me. This is in Champagne, actually, is neutral barrels or large oak barrels that are not new. Neutral meaning that the barrels are not new. They have been used. So it's just, there's no flavors being imparted into the wine from the oak itself. So these could be this size barrel, which is relatively small for neutral barrels. Some of these barrels get to be the same size as these tanks here. They can be huge, huge barrels. It's completely up to the winemaker. Or the barrels could even be this size and just be used many, many times, so there's not any flavor being imparted. What happens with barrels is barrels are quite porous. So oxygen is going to contact that wine, which is going to make the texture itself round, just like concrete did. But instead of the wine being really fresh and vibrant, you're going to get a little bit more flavor of nuts, a little bit more of a nutty aroma to the wine. And then the fourth vessel option is brand new oak. Brand new oak tends to be this very small size barrel. They tend to be around 225, 228 liters or so. And these brand new barrels are going to be charred on the inside. So there's basically going to be a fire put inside of the barrel before the staves are completely closed and before it becomes an actual barrel. And the burn on the inside of that barrel is going to create char in the barrel. That char is then going to create flavors in a wine that was put inside of it. And those flavors are honey, smoke, chocolate, caramel, vanilla, and all sorts of baking spices like cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, anise, coffee, things along those lines. I see a couple questions here. Maria, it is completely up to you if you want to take notes. You're, of course, more than welcome to take notes. If you have the basic or the industry plan, you will have access to watch this again. I'll talk a little bit more about the plans at the end. They are a subscription plan. And if you have one of them, you will be able to see this again. It will be on the site. Josh, the other red wine that doesn't go through Malo, the only one I know of is Heights Cabernet in Napa Valley, is the only red wine I know of that doesn't actually go through Malo. Good question. So that is the basic of white and red wine making. This vessel usage is completely optional. Sometimes there are wines that only spend time in stainless steel. They just go through fermentation and then they go right into bottle and they come right out to the consumer to drink. Sometimes aging occurs. There are some places in the world, wine regions in the world, that actually require the wines to be aged in barrel for a certain amount of time. Some places also require wines to be aged in bottle for a certain amount of time. So that is the basics of white wine and red wine making. Now we're going to cover rosé winemaking, but before I get into rosé, I just want to give anybody an option to ask a question about white or red wine making before we go into rosé. Okay, I don't see any question. Oh, do the vessels determine the quality of a wine? Good question, Sergio. No, not necessarily. If there is, I'm going to take Rioja, for instance. Rioja is a wine region in Spain that requires the wine to be aged in new oak barrels. Most of them are being used American oak barrels, but French oak barrels are also pretty commonly used. And so if you age the wine in a barrel for an extended amount of time, you are able to put a label on your wine. I'll just give the basics real quick. So the least aging for Rioja would be called Crianza, where the most aging, you could put the word Gran Reserva on your label. Now, a lot of people consider Gran Reservas to be better quality than Crianzas. That can be debated depending on who you are. So in that case, yes, maybe people would consider that the vessel would determine the quality of the wine. But in general, I wouldn't say that the vessels determine the quality of the wine, because a lot of wines are a certain flavor or a certain style because of the vessel that they are using, rather than it determining actually quality. What could happen, however, is there could be bad bacteria inside of a barrel, for instance, which could taint the wine, and it could reduce the quality of a wine. But in general, no, the vessels wouldn't determine the actual quality of the wine. The quality of the wine is more determined by the juice and the grapes and the winemaking and the wine growing aspects, more so than the vessel itself. Great question. Next question is, are these barrels made from a previous wine batch? I'm aware that most oak barrels come from bourbon whiskey. Oh, okay. So yes and no. um, some barrels, like you see on the screen there, those are brand new barrels that are very fresh staves. They're being charred and sent right to a winery. Some wineries have their own cooperage where they make their barrels specifically for them. In America, back in the 60s, when oak was not quite so easy to find, a lot of wineries would purchase barrels from bourbon country because they weren't as expensive. With bourbon, you can only use the barrel once. And so for bourbon country, they're always looking to sell their barrels off to other people. And yes, wine makers do buy bourbon barrels. A lot of beer producers buy bourbon barrels as well. But that's really only common in America, and it's only common in back in the 60s more so than not. Now, especially in quality winemaking, a lot of those barrels are still going to be brand new coming from a cooperage. There are, like over 20 different kinds of cooperages that use either French oak or American oak or Hungarian oak or Slovenian oak. There's all these different kinds of oak that you can use. And those different types of oak are going to create different flavors into your wine. So more often than not, especially in quality winemaking, bourbon barrels aren't being used so much anymore. Although there are some exceptions to that. There's kind of a wave of creating a bourbon aged wine right now, red wines in Napa. So some people are still buying used bourbon barrels, but in general, they're buying barrels directly from a cooperage or previously used wine barrels. Or they're reusing their barrels that they've already used from previous years. Good question. All right, into rosé winemaking. So there are 3 common methods to making rosé. The first is maceration. The second is bleeding, which is also known as the Saignée method. This would be, Saignée is the French word meaning to bleed. And then there's a blending method as well. So we're going to break into each of these. The first is the maceration method. This is most common in old world rosé winemaking. In old world meaning basically Europe. So what happens is they're going to start the wine making like we talked about for red wine making. They're going to let the skins of the grapes actually stay in contact with the juice to impart a little bit of color. The amount of time that the skin spends in contact with the juice, the darker the color is going to be. So for here instance, these super, super pale pink wines that you often see coming, especially out of Provence, are only going to spend a couple hours in contact with the skin because we only want just a touch of color. Where here, these colors are going to be maybe 10 hours or maybe up to a day of skin contact. And then when you get into a little bit deeper of a color like this, maybe this is going to be a couple days of skin contact. But when we're making rosé winemaking, we don't want the skins to stay in contact with the skins for an extended amount of time, because then we're just going to make red wine. So the amount of time is going to determine the amount of color inside of the wine. It's also going to determine the texture of the rosé as well, because again, those skins have tannins within them. So it tends to be that rosés that are more dark in color like this tend to have a touch of sweetness to them to offset those tannins, where rosés that tend to be quite light in color like this side would be, tend to be quite dry in style, meaning no perceptible levels of sugar. So this again is very common in old world rosé winemaking. However, this is often seen in the new world. This is just kind of more common than not, originating from the French region, especially of Provence, where rosé winemaking is like key to the region. The second method is the Saignée method, or the bleeding method, which means the wine is going to start as a red wine. What happens is we're going to have a tank with the skins in contact with the juice, creating a red wine. Maybe a day or two into that red wine fermentation, we're going to open up the valve and pull some of that wine out of the tank and pump it into a separate tank. There's two reasons for doing this. The first is to concentrate the wine that is still fermenting inside of the first tank. This is going to create a more complex, a more concentrated red wine. The second reason is to make a rosé wine, or to make just a second wine. Typically, a day or two into a red wine fermentation, we are going to, again, open that valve, and we're going to pump that fermenting wine into a separate tank. It might be a third of the tank, it might be a quarter of the tank, it might be a fifth of the tank. It just is completely up to the winemaker and how they want that red wine fermentation to taste. And then in the other tank, the wine that was pulled off is only going to have a little bit of color to it. And it's going to have a little bit more concentration and a little bit more intensity, because it was initially going to be a red wine. So that red wine fermentation tank, the very first one, is just going to keep going through its regular fermentation. The wine that we just pulled off that tank into the second tank is going to, again, have just a touch of color to it, and it's going to finish fermentation. This method creates, again, a little bit more of an intense, a little bit more of a robust, a little bit more of a stronger style of rosé. This is more common in New World rosé winemaking, because what happens is when you pull up a little bit of juice off of that red wine fermentation tank, you don't really want to just discard that juice. We want to try to use all of the things that we're creating. We don't want to waste. And so someone decided, oh, I should just make a rosé wine out of that, and it became a thing. So again, this is the Saignée method, the bleeding method. This is also common in sparkling wine production as well. Not as common as the blending method, however, which is our third method of rosé winemaking. So the blending method is not allowed for still rosé production. The first two methods are your only options for still rosé production, meaning a rosé without bubbles, where the blending method is allowed for sparkling wine production. What happens is you're going to make a white wine, you're going to make a red wine in two separate tanks, and then in the white wine tank, you will add maybe 5 or 10% of the red wine that you just made. What happens then is you are going to get a nice kind of soft pink color like you see here on the screen. It's going to have a little bit more of an orange color to it. And you're going to have a little bit more tannin in the sparkling wine. I'm just going to use champagne for instance. In champagne, the method of blending is the most traditional method for making rosé. Some people really enjoy and still perform the blending method when making sparkling rosé because they want their rosé to be more food friendly. When you have a little bit more structure and a little bit more body and a little bit more intensity in the wine, it makes it very, very food friendly. Where if you are doing the maceration or the bleeding method of rosé when it comes to sparkling winemaking, it's going to be softer and smoother and easier. So depending on the desired final wine style of the champagne house, and this is for all sparkling wine production, I'm just using champagne as an example. If they want it to be a little bit more fruity and easy drinking, they're going to use one of the first two methods, where if they want it to be a little bit more structured and a little bit more intense, they're going to use this third method, the blending method. So before we break into the rest of the winemaking, which is basically just the bottling side of things, are there any questions about rosé winemaking? That's a great question. When stating not permitted in blending still wine, who governs that standard? Are there producers who do not follow? Every wine country has a panel that they have to submit their wine to. This is more so in the old world than in the new world, but there are still, like the TTB, for instance, would be the governing in America, where in Italy, for instance, there would be lots of different consortios for each region. Same thing in Spain. They have congeladores that are requiring, basically, there's a little label that you put on the wine from the old world specifically that says that that wine has been approved for that region, and that is guaranteeing quality of the region. If they are not making the wine to code for that region, they will not get that label. So it could maybe be bottled as just like vin de table, which means table wine. But you wouldn't be able to put the country, the region, nothing like that could actually be on the label if you are not bottling to the rules of the region, if that makes any sense. Some regions are extremely, extremely strict with their rules, and then some regions are a little bit more relaxed. Any other questions about rosé winemaking? I'm not seeing any, so I'll just keep my eye on it. All right, so next we're going to do bottling. So bottling is going to be the last step of winemaking. This can be done on a bottling line, which is that picture there on the left. Some wineries are large enough and financially stable enough where they were able to have a bottling line inside of a winery. This specific one is in Alsace. And then the second option is that you can have a bottling truck come to your facility. On the right there, you can see the bottling truck. That's kind of a further away picture and a closer picture. And this bottling truck comes right up to your winery door, and you are still controlling your bottling. The second or the third option is to put your wine in tank and to truck those tanks to a bottling facility where the bottling is done for you and then sent back to your winery. Bottling lines are very, very expensive, so not many wineries actually have a bottling line. A lot of wineries do use these bottling trucks. And then there's also a decent amount of wineries that also send their wine out to be bottled and then have it sent back to them. So the last part of winemaking is residual sugar. Residual sugar meaning the natural grape sugars that have not been converted into alcohol during yeast fermentation. Residual sugar is allowed for most wines. There are some wine regions that dictate the amount of residual sugar that is allowed. And residual sugar is measured in grams per liter. When I say residual sugar, this is the perceivable sugar when you take a sip of wine. Residual sugar is, again, natural grape sugars that are remaining in the wine. There are some exceptions to the rule, sparkling wine being the most pronounced exception. But more often than not, sugar is never added to the wine to create sweetness in the wine. What they do is they just stop fermentation, so there are still natural grape sugars in the wine. When you look at a bottle of wine, sometimes on the back there will be a scale from dry to sweet and a little arrow saying where the wine is on the sweetness. But more often than not, it is not there. You will see these labels: dry, off dry, medium sweet, or sweet. Or there are different labels that you see for sparkling wine production, brut, things along those lines. This is a very wide range of residual sugar that could be in the wines with the label that is given to it. Dry wine, meaning no perceptible levels of sugar, in most places is actually way less than 15 grams per liter of sugar. More often than not, if a wine is dry, it's going to have between 0 and maybe 5. But there are some places in the world where that's not necessarily true. It could be up to 15. So this is just a very wide range. Every region is going to have their own definition and their own maximum grams per liter of sugar allowed for their dry styles. To put this into perspective, 5 grams per liter of sugar is the same amount as adding 1 teaspoon into 34 ounces of water, or basically 1 cube of sugar, and then so on and so forth. 100 grams per liter of sugar, which is levels that only are achieved in sweet wine production. For instance, Moscato, if you think about Moscato and how sweet Moscato is typically in that medium dry range between 35 and 70 grams of sugar. When we get up into this 100 plus, now we're in full-on dessert styles of wine. 100 grams per liter of sugar is equivalent to 21 teaspoons into 34 ounces of water, or equivalent to 25 cubes of sugar. Any questions? That is the basics of wine making for still wine production. Now, to go back onto your question, Maria, you do have access to the live recording of this class once it goes up onto the website. It takes a few days or a week or so before it will be up on the website. It will be under the Wine Basics link in the classes menu. And the 2 education plan options that you have are the basic education plan, which is a limited access plan. It's a monthly subscription for $10 a month. You have access to grape guides, the basic map resources, a glossary, current event articles, tasting tools, book and website recommendations, and then on the basic education plan, you will have access to the live recorded wine basic classes. This is a wine basic class, and the sake classes, which will be coming later this year. The industry education plan is an all access plan. You have all of the basic education plan access, plus access to industry maps. There's about 300 maps on the site. That is basically every wine region I could think of ever. And those are hand-drawn maps that are on the site. Producer resources, so these are what producers I deem classic and very typical for the major regions of the world. There's a vintage guide, which I'm putting together now. Actually, I'm almost finished with the French guide, which will be launching later this month. And there'll be study guides that will be coming down the road. And then you'll have access to all recorded classes, the wine basics, the sake classes, the sommelier workshops, and the focus sessions. That is $20 a month. So our upcoming classes, next week we have theory of deductive tasting. We will not be tasting in that class. It's all about the theory behind deductive tasting and how to become a better taster through theory, as well as tasting, of course, but we're just going to focus on the theory side of tasting. Next Friday, we're going to have our Sparkling Wine 101 class. So it's going to be very similar to this class on the beginner level. However, we're going to talk about how to make sparkling wine and all the different methods to make sparkling wine. Later this month, we have our Business of Wine class, which is all three of these are advanced classes. That doesn't mean you can't take them if you are not advanced. It's just a forewarning that they will be taught at an advanced level. The Business of Wine class is great for anyone who is sitting for the advanced exam or the master's exam. This is where we're going to break into all of the nitty-gritty details of being a sommelier that you don't see. This is all the behind the scenes, the math, the equations, the buying, the putting together, costing, all those kinds of things. The viticulture focus session is going to get real deep into vine training, the life cycle of the vine, all different things about grape growing itself. And the vinification focus session is a level up from this class. We're going to talk a lot more about all of the different options that come into winemaking. I see a few questions here. If you subscribe to an education plan, do you get discounts on the price of the classes? That's a good question. I don't have something in play at this moment. I just launched this website last week, so that's a really good point. I will put something together. That makes a lot more sense. If you have an education plan, you should get a discount to the classes. Good question. Good point. I'll put something together. Thank you for the suggestion, Maria. Sergio. Oh, awesome. Great. I will see you at the Business of Wine class. All right. Any other questions from you all about the site, about winemaking, about anything I can help you with? All right, I'm not seeing anything. So thank you all so much for joining today's class. I hope you have a great day, and I hope to see you as a member. I know we have a couple members already on. Thank you so much for signing up, and hope to see you in some future classes. Have a great day.